This is review number 3 about the development of the new nation all the way to the Adams administration. We had just gotten out of the American Revolution, and we know the Articles of Confederation was the first government. It didn't provide for an executive or a judicial branch because of what they experienced in the American Revolution. The only branch was the legislative. We know that didn't go over well. Things like Shays' Rebellion, issues with commerce, issues with paying off debt arose. And so the new Constitutional Convention will convene, and they realize they're going to scrap the articles, create a whole new constitution. And within this constitution, it allows for an executive branch, the court system, and the legislative still to remain. The new constitution provides for a president. We know in this election, Washington will win hands down, and they have to do a re-election for a vice president because we don't have political parties. Washington will become president, and Adams will become his vice president. One of the things that Washington takes from the Constitution is the idea that he could have the advice of the heads of state, and he will establish a president about a cabinet. He will appoint Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of Treasury, Jefferson as Secretary of State, and these two guys will be very pivotal. He will also establish a Secretary of War, Henry Knox. These guys will basically set the foundations for our new government, and also the skirmish between these two will set up the first political parties. The problems under the Washington administration is we had a lot of IOUs, not only to our veterans, but we also had it to foreign nations, specifically France, for their help in the French and Indian War. We are seeing that our continental currency is actually worthless. We have printed out too much. Many people don't support our new government and they fear it's going to fail. And so Alexander Hamilton is going to develop a plan to be able to pay off our debt, to be able to establish a sound currency, to get support from the wealthy. And we're going to see there's a lack of respect from the world because we have not paid back our debt, and confidence. And so Alexander Hamilton is going to create his financial plan. So let me pull that out. And his financial program really resolves in paying off our debt, tying the wealthy to our nation, and creating a stable economy. One of the first things he decides to do is pay back our certificate of indebtedness. And these are to people who were veterans, who the U.S. government could not pay back at that time for the war. Many of these have been, he's going to exchange them for new bonds and saying that we will pay them at full value. The other thing is we're going to assume state debts. The assumption of state debts basically will strengthen the federal government because the states owe the federal government when they take their debt. Also, he's going to impose a tax, an excise tax, and this will be mainly on whiskey to raise revenue, and eventually we know this will lead to the Whiskey Rebellion. The last thing and the most controversial thing is the creation of a national bank. Again, there's nothing in the Constitution that states that a national bank could be created. The only thing that's stated is that the national government can coin money. And he's going to use the elastic clause to be saying if the government should coin money, can coin money, it should be able to put this money somewhere. And so we are going to see he uses the necessary proper clause or the elastic clause to establish the national bank. And this is what's going to lead to a feud. It's going to lead to Jefferson saying that that's nowhere in the Constitution, his very strict interpretation, and he's going to found a party called the Democratic Republicans who believe in a strict interpretation. They believe in a small government for the common man. Alexander Hamilton's programs is going to be, we could see that this is his belief system in a big federal government. And they believe in a loose interpretation to be able to carry out those ideas and policies that the government has. And also it's going to be influenced, he greatly ties the rich to his party. We're going to see his plan is going to have some opposition. We're going to see the people who originally had those certificates of indebtedness have already sold it off to speculators at not the full value. And now the government's going to pay them. And so they're really upset. And these are our veterans. We're going to see that assumption of state debt is really going to upset states that have paid off their debt, such as Virginia. And what will be done is the capital will be moved close to Virginia in Maryland so that they could appease that state. The excise tax is going to upset those Western farmers who make their wheat into whiskey, and so it could ship easier, and eventually this will lead to the risky rebellion. The last thing, the National Bank, many of the Democratic Republicans feel it has too much power and they would rather have state banks. The effects of Hamilton's plan is we see that the nation credit is firmly established, the government's needs for revenue is met, that it collects taxes, it's able to pay out what it needs to people. Commerce and industry were stimulated because these businesses can borrow from the Bank of the United States, and this they would have the revenue to be able to get their business started. Again, the government is also getting support from the wealthy businessmen because the government is going to pay back their debt at full, and we see that tying these people into our government really wants them to see the government be successful. Last thing, the Bank of the United States and Hamilton's financial plan creates our first political parties, Hamilton being the leader of the Federalist Party. And I think this takes us back to our notes. Back. Hamilton being the leader of the Federalists, that he wants to help business, and we are going to see he believes in a loose interpretation, big government. Eventually we know the Federalist Party will die and they'll be replaced by the Whig Party, and eventually will go to the Republican Party today. The idea that they're all the same on this end because they favor the business. We are going to see that the Federalists and the Whigs believe in big government, and our Republicans today believe in small government. We'll talk about that shift later. The Democratic Republicans today, they are the modern Democratic Party today because they focus on the common man. Back then, the Democrats used to believe in small government, and we know our Democrats today believe in big government. We know that shift happens with the election of FDR in the 1932 election. So the goals of each party have remained the same, which means who they help, but we know the means, what type of government has changed. Originally, the Federalists believed in big government. Today, the Republicans, who are of a chain down of the Federalist Party, believe in small government states' rights. The Democratic Republicans, they believe in common man, which is what the Democratic Party believes today, but they used to believe in small government states' rights, and we know our Democrats today believe in the means of government being a strong central government. So Washington's foreign policy. He realizes that the U.S. is going to have problems with the British because mercantilism has come to an end. They no longer have the colonies to provide them all the raw resources, and they begin seizing our ships and impressing our sailors. And they are still on American soil. They're on American forts trading with the Indians. And so this will lead to Jay's Treaty. Jay will go negotiate that the British will leave the forts. They will pay for our ships. They fall short of stopping for impressment. The U.S. will promise to pay back revolutionary debts that's owed to British merchants. Again, most of the stuff's not done. The British don't leave the forts. The British will continue to impress our sailors, and the U.S. will not pay back the debts. All this leads is to a 20-year delay for the war, which will be the War of 1812. Looking at what happens here, Spain really thinks that there's an Anglo-American alliance going on, and they're very fearful because they're on the other side of the Mississippi in the Americas. And so this will lead them to negotiate Pinckney's Treaty. And Pinckney's Treaty is basically a treaty that allows for the Americans to use the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans. Big thing here is Washington realizes by the end of his administration that what's going on between France and Britain could lead to the U.S. getting involved in the war because the British are attacking our shipping for resources and they're taking our men. And the French are doing the same, not as a big scale as the British. And so Washington's farewell address warns of entangling alliances. We're going to see he establishes the precedent of the 2 terms. We know that 2-term requirement won't be required till the Truman administration after the FDR's 4 terms. Adams comes into office as president, and his vice president, because we do not have a political party ticket yet, is the Democratic Republican Jefferson. Adams is a Federalist. And we're going to see these guys will have potential conflicts because Adams will be pro-British, Jefferson will be pro-French because of their help in the American Revolution. But we are seeing that there is this war breaking out in the sea. We are having problems with the French violating our neutrality and the British. But Adams really wants to deal with the French, and he's going to send 3 dignitaries over there to talk to the French minister, the foreign minister, the Talleyrand. And instead of getting to talk to the Talleyrand sends in 3 go-betweens, their nicknames X, Y, and Z, and this will lead to the XYZ affair, where they demand tribute to be able to talk to the Talleyrand. And this will lead to an undeclared war with the U.S. for 2.5 years. And we will see the Democratic Republicans will be unhappy. We will see the Talleyrand agrees eventually to talk, but Napoleon will take power and the Franco-American alliance will be depleted. We're going to see amidst this whole almost war with France that the Federalists are going to pass 2 acts, one of them being the Alien Act that would increase the years to become a citizen from 5 to 14. This basically harms the Democratic Republican Party by preventing people from being a part of their party and being enfranchised. The Sedition Act, along with the Alien Act, it allows for the government to deport people who are questionable. The Sedition Act, again, sedition is a nice word for speech. It basically prevents people speaking out against the government, specifically the policy of the Alien Act. Again, this uproused the Democratic Republicans because it's putting limits on immigration. It's limiting their free speech, their First Amendment rights. And in reaction to this, Jefferson and Madison has come over to the Democratic Party. He used to be a Federalist. They will write the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. These resolutions will say that if a state does not like a federal law, it has the right to nullify. Again, this whole idea of states' rights. They're both unsigned essays because of the Sedition Act, but this is going to light the fire. It's going to kindle that idea that states have rights to nullify laws, which we will see, which will lead to the Civil War, which will happen in the Civil Rights Movement when states do not want to follow Brown versus Board of Education and they nullify. So this whole idea of states' rights will permeate through society. Eventually, Adams only serves 1 term, and we get into the Virginia dynasty. The Virginia dynasty is a dynasty of people who come from Virginia: Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. When Jefferson comes to office, he's going to have some issues. He's a Democratic Republican who believes in states' rights, but now he's in the executive. We are going to see that it's a close win. Jefferson is chosen by the House because people do not want an Aaron Burr, specifically Alexander Hamilton. Jefferson, again, he believes in small government, strict interpretation. He believes in states' rights. He believes in no war. He believes in a small federal government. He believes in free speech. And we're going to look at his actions, specifically with the Louisiana Purchase. Nowhere in the Constitution did it allow for that, but he purchases it. That goes against his principles, but he does it because it's going to add agrarian land, which is for the common man. So it's easy to quote one Jefferson to refute the other. We're going to see he's going to go to war with Barbary pirates. Even though he was a pacifist, he goes to war for free trade. We're going to see he reduces the national debt, which is consistent with his ideas. He removes the excise tax, which harmed the farmers, but that's going to take the government from depleting the revenue it would have gotten from the excise tax. So that's consistent and inconsistent. He will reduce the former years of immigration for becoming a citizen from 14 to 5 with the new Naturalization Act, consistent because that's enfranchising more people. He will shrink the size of our Navy with the Mosquito Fleet. Again, when we get involved in the War of 1812, that kind of bites the U.S. in the rear. He's going to impeach Samuel, or start the impeachment process and encourage Congress to impeach Samuel Chase as Justice of the Supreme Court because of his tart tongue about criticizing Jefferson. And again, he's not impeached because they realize that he had freedom of speech, and Jefferson is just upset that he's talking out against them. Jefferson was entirely against the bus when Hamilton created it, but he keeps the bus as a way of being able to organize our financial sector to be able to pay off the debts. And again, that's inconsistent because we know the bus is a loose interpretation and Jefferson is a strict interpretationist. Last thing, he reduces the Army and Navy. Again, small bureaucracy, but we will see that will give us trouble in the War of 1812. what is going to happen is Napoleon takes over in Europe. And it's this whole war between Napoleon and the British and the Russians who have united together against Napoleon that is going to lead to an effect in the Americas that we will be attacked. One of the things that's going to happen is there's going to be a stalemate. The British are superior on the sea. Napoleon is superior on the land. And what they're going to do is they're going to attack the free trade. And this is what's going to impact the U.S., that our ships are going to be seized, our men are going to be impressed. And this will lead to Jefferson realizing the only way to get the other European countries to respect us is to place an embargo. Do not let anything go out to these European powers, and they will respect our independence. Again, it does not work that way. We're going to see some Americans will not listen to this, and specifically in New England. They're going to see our economy be hurt, specifically the farmers, when our resources will mount. Eventually, Congress will pass the Non-Intercourse Act saying we could trade with the rest of the world except Great Britain and France. Our boats will go out into the open seas. They will be attacked and they will be impressed, and our goods will be taken. So this will eventually realize that the Embargo and Non-Intercourse Act did not work. What it will help the U.S. with is that it's going to establish American industry. Prior to this, we have been dependent entirely on the British for manufactured goods. But because we're at this little schism with them, we can't just openly ask them for weapons and manufactured goods if we're having an embargo on them. Eventually, under the Madison administration, the Makin's Bill is passed. It basically says that we're going to trade with the rest of the world, but if either France or Great Britain removes its restrictions, we will trade with them and restrict trade with the others. Napoleon agrees. Again, this is calculated on Napoleon because once he agrees, he knows that he's not going to have any feuds with the Americans, and this could possibly lead to war with the British. And this is great for him because if the British are fighting the Americans and fighting him, he has just divided their army and navy. We're going to see we go to war with the British beyond the Makin's Bill being agreed by the French because they are impressing. We have other issues with them. They keep on taking our soldiers. They keep on taking our cargo. Also, they're still in the front, supplying the Indians with arms who are attacking American citizens as they move west. And we're going to see William Henry Harrison will go out in the Battle of Tippecanoe and deal with the Indians there. We are going to see the Warhawks. The Warhawks see that if we go to war with the British, that this possibly could lead that the British will lose their holdings in Canada. And Canada, I know we think of it as an icebox, and it does snow there a lot, but when that snow melts, this is great agricultural land, which will lead to more Democratic Republican states. There are people who specifically oppose this war, which are the Federalists. They also feel that why are we going to war with the British when the French have also violated our neutrality? These New England merchants trade specifically with Great Britain and will violate a lot of the embargoes by trading with them. And even when war breaks out in the War of 1812, they will still trade with the British. And they also feel that from the Jefferson policies, we are not prepared for war. He has made our military smaller. So the Federalists will blame this war on Mr. Madison. And we were going to see that this war will eventually result in a ceasefire. And a lot of it stems from the Russians coming in and telling the British, look, Napoleon is dividing your army. Do not fight with the Americans. And this will eventually lead to a ceasefire with the Treaty of Ghent. And in this treaty, they basically both return everything to the status quo. So we basically fought a war to return everything to what it was. There's going to be a couple of things that will result of the war. We see the Star-Spangled Banner is created with Francis Scott Key. We see the burning of Washington, D.C. And we see after the war is negotiated, after the treaty again, Jackson will win in the Battle of New Orleans. This is hysteria in America. Hooray, we defeat the British, but it really doesn't count. But we stood up to them and we did not lose and we did not become colonies again. But the one specific party that dislikes what's going on in the war is the Federalist Party. And they're going to meet at Hartford. And remember, they've been big government, and they want the government to be more restrictive. They want to make it harder for them to pass treaties. They want to make it harder for Congress to declare war. They want to make it harder for our government to regulate trade. And so the Federalists have just made this whole idea that they're big government, but now they're making it harder for the government to implement laws. They just flipped on their ideas. And the Federalist Party will die. And a lot of it is why they die is they're being Debbie Downers amidst the whole Battle of New Orleans and America not losing in the War of 1812. The results of the war is nationalism will rise up. We'll see a new White House bill. We'll have new American literature. We'll have a new American art. But we also get the beginnings of sectionalism because this is going to lead to the tariff. We're going to see eras of roads and canals being built. The Federalist Party is dead, so we move to one-party rule, which will kind of conflict in the war, in the election of 1824. We see industrialization has occurred because we couldn't ask for the British to give us weapons in the war and trade as manufactured goods. So our New England area will become an area of manufactured growth. Also, amidst this, our war hawks Clay, Calhoun, and Webster will become leaders, and these will be guys who would lead to compromise. America will turn to isolationism, and we turn inward, and we get into the era of good feelings. And we talked about this being a misnomer, that idea that one-party rule is occurring, but we have sectionalism. We're going to see John Quincy Adams is going to be the Secretary of State for Monroe, and he's going to negotiate the Treaty of 1818 that basically establishes the 49th parallel. Also, he negotiates the Rush-Bagot Treaty that demilitarizes the Great Lakes. We rush to the Great Lakes and we bag up all the weapons. He also negotiates the Florida Purchase Treaty because Andrew Jackson was sent down there to establish rule and order, and he kind of goes crazy and kills a lot of people, sets $5 million in damage. But the Florida Purchase Treaty will give us our control of Florida, but the U.S. will give up claims to Texas. The Monroe Doctrine is established under the Monroe administration, and a lot of it's not Monroe. It's really his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, realizing what is the only way for us to protect ourselves from future invasion is basically to say the Western powers do not want the Europeans in the Western Hemisphere. And the Monroe Doctrine is, he says, is issued to protect Latin America from the Europeans. But it's basically close up shop. There's no more land for people to colonize and no more intervention. The irony at this time, the U.S. cannot really enforce it and is going to require that the Europeans listen to this. Eventually, we will use this in the era of imperialism. This era is an era of nationalism. We see the American system come out that is going to create tariffs to protect our industry from foreign goods. It's also going to create roads and canals, which will unite our economy and try to make it more self-sufficient. But we also know this American system will create a rift between the North and the South because the tariffs are going to benefit the North and not the South. The roads and canals are going to be in the North, not the South. We're going to see new literature, new art, such as the Hudson River School, that will champion American landscapes. We rebuilt the Capitol. We increased the Army and Navy. We revived the bus. And we're going to see the Land Act of 1820. And this Land Act of 1820 is basically the Missouri Compromise. This whole idea that we're going to establish a precedent for westward expansion, that 3630, anything above that is free, anything below that is slave. And we're going to maintain this balance that as one slave state comes in, one free state will come in. So at this time in the Missouri Compromise, Missouri comes in as a slave state, and Maine comes in as a free state. And we're going to keep this sectional balance. But we also know that leads to sectionalism. So sectionalism is an absence of political parties because we only have one because the Federalists have died in the Hartford Convention. We're going to see sectionalism is really going to reside in our sections. The North being manufacturing, liking roads and tariffs. The West being mainly agriculture, specifically foods and grains, that they're going to like the roads and the canals, but not the tariffs. And the South dislikes the tariffs because they get no protection and they dislike the roads and canals. And it's these sectionalist ideas that will dovetail into political parties that will set the foundation for the Civil War. So roads will eventually come out, and we're going to see it's going to move population to the west. And the North's not going to like this because they're going to lose their agriculture, their workers to becoming farmers in the East to produce agriculture. We know the tariff of 1860 is our first protective one that protects New England merchants at the expense of everybody paying higher prices. We're going to see the Panic of 1819 happens, and a lot of this happened from speculation on Western lands that people had borrowed money from the bank. They were hoping that they could buy land at a cheap price, sell it at a higher price, and that did not work out. I've already talked about the Missouri Compromise and how we had agreed to bring in Missouri as a free state, and Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and establish 3630. This basically is going to establish that balance. As we let in one free state, we need to let in one slave state. Also, it's going to set the balance that Congress, every single time that they add in a territory, they should butt in and have a say about slavery. Last thing is the appointment of John Marshall. John Marshall is going to really bolster the power of the Supreme Court. The first one he bolsters the power of the Supreme Court is in the case Marbury versus Madison. This whole idea, Marbury did not get his appointment under the Adams administration, and he's upset and he's suing Madison, who is the new Secretary of State for Jefferson, for his seat. And we're going to see John Marshall looks at this case and he realizes he has no authority over it. And this is what establishes judicial review, that the Supreme Court can review what is going on and make determinations about the final say of the Constitution. The next case is McAuliffe versus Maryland. McAuliffe is the head of the Bank of the United States in Maryland, and Maryland has decided to tax their banknotes. And it looks at this whole federalism thing. Does the state have the right to put laws on the federal system? Or is it only the federal government has the right to put laws on the state? And Marbury will look at this and he will basically say, first off, the Bank of the United States is constitutional by the elastic clause, necessary proper clause. And also, he will state that the states do not have the right to tax the federal government. He establishes this whole idea of federalism. The federal government is superior to the states. Our last case is Gibbons versus Ogden. This dealt with the monopoly on the new and a river in the Hudson River. Again, one is established by the state, one is established by the federal government. And again, Congress comes in at this time and the Supreme Court saying that they have control of interstate commerce, not the states. Again, the Supreme Court will validate that only Congress can regulate interstate commerce. Okay, guys, we'll be moving to review 4.